Hello, and welcome to our conversation hosted by the Asian American Foundation. My name is Jose Antonio Vargas. I am Filipino American. I'm a journalist, author, filmmaker, and the founder of Define American. Define American is a culture change organization that uses the power of narrative to humanize conversations about immigrants in this country. Today's conversation will be a celebration of African American history through the lens of the Asian American Pacific Islander community, the fastest growing racial and immigrant group in this country. The African American civil rights struggle ultimately led to the civil rights that 23 million Asian American Pacific Islanders enjoy today. We also recognize the long history of solidarity between the African American and Asian American communities. And to discuss these issues, we have assembled really an all-star panel. We have Professor J. Philip Thompson, former Deputy Mayor of New York City, Tiffany Cross, journalist and host of MSNBC's The Cross Connection. Please make sure to check that out. Joanne Yu, Executive Director of the Asian American Federation. And last but not the least, Norman Chen, CEO of the Asian American Foundation. I'm actually going to go with the first question to Professor Thompson. If you can, give us a brief outline of where Asian American history has intersected with African American history.
Well, if you go all the way back to the 19th century, African American leaders thought that Chinese workers were brought into the United States to become semi-slaves. Particularly after the Civil War, when a lot of Black labor was no longer available as slaves, they brought in what were called coolies. And African Americans always saw that as an attempt to enslave or make semi-slaves out of Asian workers. So they viewed Asians as victims of racism in the same way Black folks were. And Frederick Douglass, the former slave Black leader, came out very strongly against the Chinese Exclusion Act in the 1880s. The National Colored Workers Union, which was formed after the Civil War when white unions didn't admit Black workers, made appeals to Chinese workers to join with them into the colored union. And in the early 20th century, 1906, when the NAACP was formed by W.B. Du Bois and others, they called it colored, explicitly not African, when a lot of church denominations were being named African, AME, African Methodist Episcopal, etc. They said colored because what these former plantation owners had done is set up plantations in the Philippines and in Hawaii and in Central America. So the African American struggle is part of a global struggle, and they never would have done this in Europe. They never would have had this kind of treatment of people. In Europe, it's directed against workers of color and people of color. So let's call ourselves Colored National Colored Association. And so that was very conscious. Then it was Japanese radicals and Indian radicals who actually internationalized the Black struggle in the United States in the teens around World War I and introduced resolutions calling for recognition of Black Americans' right to self-determination in the United States. And during World War II, many Black newspapers and the NAACP and Du Bois came out strong against Japanese internment. And in fact, the State Department banned a lot of Black newspapers and censored them for coming out in support of Japanese Americans during World War II. And we found that in the 1920s, Martin Luther King's mentor, Reverend Howard Washington Thurman, went to India and started learning about nonviolence resistance as a philosophy and as a strategy. My own godfather was a minister and part of that circle, went to India, was trained in the 1940s in advocacy. Martin Luther King got that knowledge from that interaction in India at the time. And so these ties go way back. And then more recently, Asian Americans were very active in the anti-apartheid movement in the 70s, of which I was a part of. We worked very closely supporting the ANC, the PAC, the Zimbabwe movement, the Frelimo movement in Mozambique. Asians were heavily involved in that. Same thing goes for the Jackson campaigns in '84 and '88. I worked in it too, side by side. Asian Americans, Black Americans, we worked together. Same in the Obama campaign, same in David Dinkins' campaign, the first Black mayor of New York, same in Senator Warnock's recent election in Georgia. And last, I'd say today, two leaders of Black workers. One is Julie Su. She's Deputy Labor Secretary. She's made defending and protecting Black workers her #1 priority. Ai-jen Poo is head of the National Domestic Workers Alliance. 1/3 of the workers are Black women. And she's Chinese, as is Julie Su. So there's a long history here. And I'm sorry to take so long, but there's a long history.
Well, as you were talking, though, I was just reminded how so much of that history is not part of the master narrative of American history that we were taught, that I was taught in high school and even in college, right? And Tiffany, I want to bring you in because, you know, I've been loving your show, The Cross Connection, and what you've been doing is really centering voices of color from all across America every week. So first of all, like, really thank you for giving Asian Americans such a prominent platform. That in itself is a form of incredible solidarity. Can you tell us about your intent to include Asian Americans in these conversations, and how has what Professor Thompson outlined, you know, informed your work?
Thank you, Jose, for that. And, you know, I appreciate your gratitude. And I have to say, when anytime we do segments on we center AAPI voices, I get overwhelmed with gratitude from people. And I just want people to know I'm not doing a favor to anyone. This is my responsibility to center the rising majority of this country. It is my honor and privilege and responsibility to do that. And, you know, I think when we read some of the print articles, every expert is a white person. We, you know, see a lot of white voices centered on every other aspect of television. So I really am intentional about having AAPI voices on my show that are not always talking about AAPI issues. You know, sometimes we will talk specifically about AAPI issues, but sometimes you're just there as a person who happens to be an expert on things. And I think that's crucially important. And just to remark on the wonderful Professor Thompson's comments, I think there is, it's very intentional, right, to pit communities of color against each other. You just talked about you didn't learn any of this in school because the master narrators have something to gain by making sure that these communities stay divided. I very much believe in the Fred Hampton approach of let's lock arms together, because what you see in your screen right now, this is the fastest growing community in this country, the AAPI community. People, even on my show, to be completely transparent, the same way there is anti-Black sentiment in some pockets of the AAPI community, certainly within the Black community, I hear from people who say, why are you including AAPI voices? They're white adjacent, they don't want to ally with us. And that is a narrative that is introduced by systems of white supremacy that have something to gain by keeping us separated. And on my show, I do not prioritize the comfort or narrative of white folks who have been the master narrators in this country for a long time. And the more that we learn about each other, the more that everybody, including our white allies, the more that everybody has some intellectual curiosity about our fellow countrymen, we not only learn American history, because that's what this is to all of us as Americans, it's American history, but we also have a better idea of how to move forward in locked arms. When Professor Thompson was talking about Chinese laborers, I mean, I don't think so many people realize that there were over 15,000 Chinese workers who helped build the transcontinental railroads. There were, you know, what happened during the Japanese internment camps, how, you know, the immigration policy of this country certainly impacted some of the discord in American politics, certainly after the quota system of 1965 changed that prioritized Korean Americans coming into this country. So there's always been unity, but there has certainly been seeds of discord that was strategically placed within our communities that I think, you know, still trickles down on some level today. And it's all of our responsibility to inform our fellow Americans, our communities, take responsibility for what happens in our communities and to help keep bridging this gap. And I certainly try to do that on my show every Saturday. And the more people learn, I think the better position they are to tamp down. We don't ever want to adopt the behavior of the oppressor. We want to imagine a country in democracy as we collectively build it, especially in a post-pandemic world, as we're all trying to navigate this ground zero, so to speak, amid this racial reckoning, as they call it. While we celebrate a cultural shift, I think we need to get a little more excited about a power shift, because the cultural shift says, hey, we need to be more inclusive of these voices, and hey, we need to allow these voices space. And you can see that, right? It still positions the existing power structure in a position of power. A power shift says, we are the deciders. We're not asking you to hire us. We're doing the hiring. We're not asking you for space to exist. We are declaring our existence unapologetically without centering master narrators and existing freely and joyfully. So I really am privileged and honored to lock arms with my brothers and sisters in the AAPI community, not only on my show, but even behind the scenes in ways that we can uplift each other's communities and make sure that we are always in lockstep as a larger collective unit as representatives of the rising majority of this country.
And Tiffany, I am so glad that you named that, because I think, that's something that I think is not commonly held, that this belief that actually Asian Americans are the fastest growing racial group and immigrant group in this country, right?
Yeah.
That's just not part of the context in which Asian Americans are spoken about. And this is where I want to bring Norman, as the head of the Asian American Foundation. Can you say a bit about what lessons from African American advocacy and organizing you bring to your leadership here at the Asian American Foundation?
Definitely. Thank you, Professor Thompson and Tiffany, for your wonderful comments and incredible work. As you laid out, Asian Americans' progress in America would not be possible without the inspiring and heroic activism of our civil rights heroes. From Frederick Douglass's powerful Composite America speech you mentioned, Professor, to advocating for Chinese Americans to be allowed to be immigrants and citizens in the US, to the civil rights movement that paved the way for the 1965 Immigration Act. The African American community has been at the forefront fighting for the rights and freedoms of all people of color in America. At the Asian American Foundation, our mission is to serve the Asian American and Pacific Islander community in their pursuit of belonging and prosperity that is free from discrimination, slander, and violence. Ever since we first came here, as recorded in the Filipinos in 1763, to escape imprisonment aboard Spanish galleons in New Orleans, and throughout each succeeding wave of immigration from Asia and the Pacific since then, Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders have fought and endured in our struggle to be valued by American society. Yet, despite our community's remarkable success and contributions across social, economic, and political realms, progress towards greater national acceptance and belonging continues to be threatened by terrible violence, cycles of xenophobia, and race-based antagonism. The time for change is now. As many of you know, the civil rights movement coincided with the birth of mass media. Civil rights heroes were able to reach white audiences across America using media, film, photography, and storytelling to magnify historic protests and create empathy and belonging. We stand at another historic moment of mass media. Social media, which my kids know a lot better than me, viral content, podcasts, filmmaking. TAF will be investing tremendously in creating a cultural shift through storytelling and through media. We also know that we cannot achieve progress without intersectionality and partners from all communities. The fight for civil rights was a true rainbow coalition, and we must continue that legacy to ensure a vision of America where opportunities to participate in all aspects of society are equally accessible, and individuals and communities are not rendered invisible, nor singled out for false stereotypes, discrimination, or hate on the basis of race. Thank you all for all of your work, and we look forward to the rest of the conversation.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Norman. And I want to bring in Joanne here. I mean, first of all, Joanne, thank you so much for your leadership in the face of growing hate and violence in New York City. If you all, by the way, are not following Next Shark on Instagram, I highly recommend. It's become such a must-go place for me as an Asian American to just see what's happening, right? And we're seeing, unfortunate, continued violence. Your organization, the Asian American Federation, has been essential to protecting our communities because your work is New York City centered. Can you tell us, please, about the lessons learned from our African American and Asian American heroes when it comes to solidarity and intersectionality and how that informs the Asian American Federation's mission.
Absolutely. Thank you for inviting me. I like to yield my time to Professor Thompson, but he's going to insist that I get to speak my piece here today. And I'll start with something personally for me. I think, Professor Thompson, when he was at City Hall, he was the person I checked in regularly. It was a 10-minute walk from my office. He always had time for me. I consider him one of the most important mentors that I've had in shaping the work that we're doing. And I'll say that for a lot of us leaders, we connect with the leaders who've gone before us, and that really has been the Black leaders. And I'll say they've given me strength to express my anger and anguish. They helped me to frame my advocacy. And to be honest, I feel like they've really given me wings. Professor Thompson, this is all your fault. And they've helped me to figure out how to organize and ask for solutions. And those conversations are still ongoing. And at the Federation, our work really is to elevate the stories, the needs of the poorest New Yorkers, those who are poorest Asian Americans who are invisible, who are marginalized. And we need to uplift those stories so that we can get social, economic justice on the ground. And our work isn't just to elevate something for the Asian American community. That is not the work. It is really to look at who is not getting the resources they need. How do we stand together? How do we stand together? Because we cannot just uplift one community when other communities are marginalized. And so while we center our work, there's, the Federation has done, really important work, behind the scenes conversations, developed deep friendships with the African American leaders in our city. And I also want to add that, the communities of color have been marginalized for a really long time. And we have had very little investment in infrastructure building in our communities, the Black, Latino, Asian communities. And all of this became so apparent during the pandemic when we saw who was dying, we saw who had to go to work, and there was no choice to work from home. And we have stood up for each other. We have said this is not right. And now as we talk about, anti-Asian hate, there is this really horrific narrative about this false Black Asian tension. And I think what I want to say is, if you peel back the onion, and I don't want to just, I love social media too, right? I love to look at the little GIFs and all of that stuff. But if you really sit and do some critical thinking and peel back the onion, you realize sometimes the assailants, they're out living in the street because they're homeless. Mm-hmm. There's mental illness. And you think about, well, why is there no infrastructure to address that? And why is it that, many of the homeless I think by city records, many of the homeless are African Americans, are Blacks. I want to know why that is. Those are the questions I want to elevate. Why isn't there help available? Why? So that way it creates this tension where people misunderstand what they're seeing. And we know from all the records that we have, and we keep our records too, that many of the attackers, majority of the attackers are actually white people. And I can't tell you how many stories I've heard of people saying, well, how can you dispute the videos, right? But those are just highlighted case, those are the few cases that somebody happened to capture, but the overall numbers, they're not African Americans, right? And so we need to start to, for my community, I always want to elevate this, because we have to start to have some critical thinking. We need to start to look at, not just the videos, right? Like not the 20-second thing that we see on Facebook, but really to look at what is happening, but also to raise relevant questions about the systemic failure and the support that our communities never got. And so now here we are, as Tiffany said, there is this tension or perceived tension because, as I see it, there's been an underinvestment in our communities. And this narrative is written that continues to try to divide our communities. And right now, I think what we need to have more conversations like this, and for us to stand in solidarity. And like I said, our work isn't just to say we only want economic justice. We only want social justice for Asian Americans. Our fates are tied together, and we need to understand that, and we need to work together in a very real way, in a very honest way. And I'm so proud to say this is the work that we're doing.
Thank you for that, Joanne. And as you were talking, I'm reminded, I don't know if you could see James Baldwin right behind me.
I see. I love that, Jose.
And that great quote, right? You know, our history is each other. That is our only guide. Our history is each other. That is our only guide, from Baldwin. And as you were talking, Joanne, I was reminded by what Tiffany, surfaced a few minutes ago, because I think to make sure that, we have credibility in this conversation, we can't just talk about solidarity and not talk about the long history of conflict, right? That in many ways, I think we've focused a lot on the conflict, but I think we can't talk about solidarity without acknowledging what are the roots of those conflicts between the Asian American and African American communities that continues until today. What can we do? And this is a question I asked to all of you. What can we do to address and confront these challenges? And I think, Joanne, you spoke to the critical thinking skills that is needed. You've talked about how we need to actually peel the onion, but I'm just curious from everybody's perspective here, what else can we do to address and confront that challenge?
Do you mind if I hop in? I just want to respond to some things that the wonderful Joanne said, and I really hope I get to meet you in person one day, Joanne, because I love your thoughts. And I have to tell you, for a period of weeks, there were people within the network and outside the network who kept pitching these segments to me. Let's talk about the Black AAP divide. Let's talk about these violent attacks by Black people on Asian Americans in this country. And I was so utterly offended by it, because the instinct was to leapfrog over all that white supremacy and go to people who were clearly mentally disturbed. When we saw sane ass white people in suits and business suits walking down the street saying ugly things, when we saw violent white people doing things to AAPI communities and members of the AAPI community. And I think that is the bigger problem, right? Because the media has an outsized influence on how we treat each other and how we perceive each other in this country. And I think that feeds things like, even if you're not someone who is reading the New York Times every day, or if you're somebody who's reading the headline and not the story, you can walk away with a false narrative. And I think a great example of that, in addition to the AAPI violence, is the anti-affirmative action lawsuit happening at Harvard. On the face of it, you think, oh, all these AAPI members of the AAPI community don't want affirmative action, when that's simply not true. This is something that is run by a conservative right-wing extremist who has found a way to find a very small pocket of members, mostly in the Chinese community, that is not representative of the Chinese diaspora in this country at all, and use them and weaponize them as against each other, right? Let's paint this narrative that AAPI people don't like Black people, and our work here is done as people who traffic in white supremacy. And it's really frustrating and terrible to see. And I so value what Joanne said, because I think those are the right questions. If Black people are overrepresented as homeless people who are doing these attacks, those are the questions to ask, not let's, feed into this narrative about Black folks attacking AAPI people. And I think for those of us who are leaders in our respective communities, those are the things that we have to take the responsibility in doing. And it's not necessarily specific to us all the time, and it's not fair that it's our responsibility, because again, I think white people have a role to play in this as well. But in encouraging people and informing people, just reminding people, hey, this country has not been kind to any community of color. And so when you deem someone else your enemy, you are doing the work for them, and let's collectively not do that as communities. So I just wanted to jump in there from a media perspective and say, I hold the line on that all the time. I do not feed into that narrative, and I have made calls when I've seen my colleagues feed into that narrative, and I try to mind my business and let other people do their show, but when I've seen that storyline pop up, I've had to say, this is so disrespectful to both communities. And I'm glad to hear that we all are on that same page, because it's just a false narrative that only helps the white infrastructure of this country, not either of our communities.
I would also add to that most New Yorkers actually by a large margin, are Black, Latino, or Asian. And
yep.
in fact, in every major city and every medium-sized city in America now, it's majority Black, Latino, and Asian, all across America. And if you add the young white folks in cities, 80% of them voted for Obama twice. And so there's a potential powerful coalition there that's actually going to become a majority in the country numerically in a decade or two. That is the reality, but you don't see that reflected in the media. And I think all of us have to start in our own communities, stop acting like this is a white people's country and white people get to say who belongs and who doesn't belong, and they get to tell us who our friends are and who our enemies are. We got to get out of that mindset and figure out ways we start having conversations amongst each other, as Joanne and Tiffany both were talking about. And the second thing I would say, Tiffany mentioned the Black Panthers. When I was 12, the Black Panthers in West Philly gave me a little red book. I didn't even know what a red book was, couldn't interpret it. But China recognized the Black student movement in 1968 and recognized the Black Panthers and invited Black students to go to China in 1972 and really made the Black student struggle an international struggle. And today, I see a lot of propaganda in the news about China's our enemy. We gotta, as far as I can tell, the Chinese people have been fighting poverty. That's been the main thing. In their last 30 years, we've been fighting poverty too. I think we ought to exercise caution when people tell us this country's your enemy. We need to understand who are the people. We need to get to know those people. They need to know us. I don't see any value in us pumping money into a war machine to fight China and not funding our schools, not funding. We need affordable housing. We need a lot of things. We don't need guns and missiles as our first priority if we can avoid that. And we need to get to know people in China. We need to get to know people in the Philippines, in Korea, all over, and start having our own relationships and conversations, not just waiting for somebody else to tell us who we ought to hate and who we ought to love.
And I'm gonna out Professor Thompson here. So when the Asian American social justice movement was beginning in New York City, a young J. Philip Thompson made his way over to Chinatown to teach the community how to organize. And so once in a while, when he and I would sit together, I would say, look at all of these groups. There's about 70 plus groups now. I said, this is the fruit of your labor, right? This is what you stood in solidarity with. There are stories that, of deep friendships. The things that we don't know, we were taught that by leaders like, I always want to say Deputy Mayor Thompson, by Professor Thompson. These are the stories. I also want to talk about, critical thinking skills, because, when we look at and really look at the situation, I feel like we're missing that because we are all wanting instant stories that feel good, that instant outrage. But if you look at what really happened, I think those are the moments that we have to pause and think, oh, maybe I was wrong. So if you look at, we're approaching the anniversary of Saigu, which is the LA riots, right? That narrative has always been the Black Asian conflict, but Black Korean conflict, right? But the reality is that the then LA mayor refused to send help to calm people down. So that's what the devastation happened to the small businesses, because help was sent to protect the rich white neighborhoods. Those two communities were left to duke it out, right? And there was nobody to intervene, nobody to calm the situation down, because we were not a priority, right? Even when there is great tension and great strife and you see people harming each other, where is the help that we're supposed to get, right? Where are the people coming to be able to calm everybody down, to say, everybody calm down, this is gonna be okay, right? Where was that? Well, we two communities, the Black and Korean communities, never got that. And, I feel like, is this an opportunity for us to have an honest, open conversation, right? And from these conversations, we need to look at the shared interests that we have. You know, the one example that I think about all the time is about the forces that prevent people from voting, right? Like that is all over for, you know, the Black community, how that is just, you know, that is just, I can't even put into words how frustrating it is, right? And I hope to God, Asian Americans thinking, well, you know, we get to vote, so what do I care if a Black, you know, grandma has to, you know, walk 5 miles and stand in line and she can't get any water. Why do I care? Because that stuff is going to trickle down to us too, right? And those forces are going to prevent us from voting. Because if you look at the Asian American community, they're voting Democrat. And so all of these forces that prevent us from deciding our own fate, you know, for us to work together, to be able to have a voice in what is happening, that is also impacting us. And we need to recognize that. And these are the shared points of common interest that we need to rally together, link arms, and to say, hell no. And it's okay to tell our community to say, hell no. It's okay, because for too long we've nodded and said, okay, maybe this is not going to impact us. Oh, trust me, it's going to impact us. And it is okay now, especially with all the lessons that we're learning. I think it is time for us to raise our voices to say, when something isn't right, it's okay for you to say something.
The Bloods and the Crips,
Oh,
the Bloods and the Crips in '92 in LA went to the mayor and said, we'll stop gangbanging, we'll stop selling drugs if you can come up with a jobs program. And they were rebuffed at the very same time that the South Korean community was asking for help. And so to Joanne's point, we had these same issues in New York in the 80s, and it is about leadership, you know, what we do.
Norman.
No, these are powerful points. I was just going to add, you know, for us, we believe one of the most powerful antidotes towards racism is education. And Professor Thompson, you brought that up, just the need to understand the history. So many people don't understand our history, our collective history enough. And so that's one area we're putting a lot of emphasis in. As you know, the TEACH Act was passed in Illinois last year, mandating the teaching of Asian American history for the first time, Asian American Pacific Islander history for the first time. And so we're working very closely with people on the ground there to make sure that's done successfully. And also in other states, New Jersey has recently passed similar legislation. So education about our combined communities, about the intersectionality between our communities is really important. On solidarity, it's a significant unmet need in our community. When we talk to people in New York, in Chicago, in Oakland, we see tensions are very, very high right now. And when we ask, you know, what programs exist, there are very few that are successfully bringing our communities together. And it starts with getting to know each other, just like you said, and breaking bread together and building relationships. And so we're committed to leading that or kicking that off this year. Supporting organizations that are building connections between our communities, really dedicating resources to that. And hopefully we can start to, you know, bring people together. I mean, this month is a great example, right? February is Black History Month. It's also Lunar New Year month. And so how wonderful is it to bring together our communities to just get to know each other, celebrate over food, over music, over culture, build these relationships so that we can then find better solutions.
As I was listening to this, I kept wondering, Tiffany, as someone who's worked in newsrooms, how many people have been in your position to say, no, I'm not going to feed into that. No, we're not going to put that on air. Because too often, I think what we've seen is that we kind of just go to like, we just go to the trope. We just go to the stereotype. We just go to the easy narrative, right? And as I was listening to this conversation, I kept thinking that is what we need. How do we make sure that people are in those positions like you are, Tiffany, so that can happen?
Well, you know, I think one way is exercising our own voices. The fastest way to lose power is to not recognize the power that you have. And I will tell you, and Jose, I'm sure you know this, there are people who look like us who get to this position. And I think when you have been welcomed by Empire, your instinct might be to help uphold Empire. And that's not my drive here. That's not my passion here. I am here to represent the rising majority of this country. And if that ever conflicts, if if my belief and outlook ever runs contrary to whatever corporate entity I'm a part of, then I have the integrity to walk away. And I've seen it time and again where people feel like, well, this is, clickbait, or this is the thing that will get us ratings, or this is the thing that the big bosses want to do. And I've had even people tell me, well, yes, I was in that meeting and I heard that thing, but I was the only Black person there and I didn't want to be like the Black person complaining about things. I'm like, who gives a shit? Like, why are you there if not to use your voice? Stand up in that moment and declare yourself, yeah, this is some BS that you guys are doing and we can't go along and support that. And I've seen it so many times where people don't do that. But on the bright side, Jose, because I'm sure you know this after, spending so much time in newsrooms, that is changing. It's a slow progression, but it is changing, and people have felt empowered to take an active role in how narratives are shaped. And I always, here at NBC, Cesar Conde is committed to having 50% of our newsroom be women and people of color, to make sure that our newsroom reflects America. And I think that makes such a huge difference, because as people, you can fill a newsroom with a bunch of junior people who are diverse, but if they're not the decision makers, if they have no editorial power, then that's not really holding our industry accountable. And so I think having people in positions of power certainly impact it. And there's money in diversity. It contributes to the corporation's bottom line. My show, by centering the rising voices, we're the highest rated weekend show on the network. We average 5 million viewers per month. We have an outsized portion of people of color who tune into our show, and that is where ad dollars are going. And so it just benefits us all to have reflections that reflect our collective lived experiences on the screen. And we continue to see that, and I'll continue to fight the good fight. But the second they say, hey, we just need you to be a little more balanced and, don't always center these voices, I will toss the deuces, even at my own peril. I won't stand for it. And I wish that I had more colleagues to do that, to be quite honest.
And now this is actually the question for the whole group. And actually, this just actually builds right into what Tiffany was saying. So what gives you all hope as we think of solidarity and unity for the future, for the present and the future of our country? Like, what gives you hope?
Well, I'm really inspired. Joanne and I are both part of what's called a Racial Justice Commission in New York, which is actually a charter revision commission with the power to rewrite the city's constitution, which is our charter. And we, all 11 members are people of color, and we all work together, and actually together came up with a preamble to the charter, which really talks about our combined struggles and our intersectionality, and then concrete measures for really continuing this fight agency by agency and dealing with issues like living wages and other things like that. That gives me a lot of hope. Seeing folks like Joanne gives me a lot of hope. But I will say this also, the heroes of the pandemic in New York City were the hundreds of thousands of home care workers and nursing home workers, 90% of whom are women of color, a lot of Asian women, a lot of Latina women, a lot of Black women. They make about $20,000 a year. They are the lowest paid workers, period. They were the ones who didn't get PPE. They were the last ones to get it. They were the first ones to die on the front lines. And so these women actually died together, and they saved many other lives together. That gives me inspiration. And I just think we have to lift up them, as Tiffany is talking about, and give them their due. And then I think we'll actually achieve power, because these women, they are the biggest occupation in New York. They are in every community. They lead heads. They are heads of household more often than not. And they're courageous. And so that's what gives me inspiration.
Certainly, women are our hope. For me, children are our hope. Our the next generation are our hope. If you look at our data, we see significant trends where the older population tends to be more conservative, whereas the younger population is more open-minded, more progressive. And you just look at families, right? My parents' generation, they tend to hang out with mostly Chinese American people. Our generation is much more mixed. Our kids' generation, I have kids who are teenagers. Wow. I mean, the last thing they'll tell me when they bring a friend over is, what race that person is. It's just not something they think about consciously. They're very open-minded, much more global. And so I'm inspired by the youth and also their defiance. You know, the younger generation of Asian Americans, they look at people who question their Americanness or their loyalty, and they're just shocked. You know, they don't put up with that. They don't accept that anymore. And so that defiance, their open-mindedness, that's what gives me hope, and that's who we're working for.
Joanne?
I would say my hope is, my immediate hope actually is to go to lunch with Professor Thompson. We've been trying that forever. We keep saying we're gonna go get Korean barbecue, and like, you know, then Omicron hits and then something else hits. So that's my immediate goal. That's my hope, that we're gonna sit down real soon, because there's a lot of people from my community, my leaders, who want to meet with him. And certainly, you know, he is, you know, a great influencer throughout New York City, and, you know, things he says is very important. And, you know, as you can tell, I'm tremendously fond of him. My hope is that, you know, I keep thinking of, you know, the phoenix, right? Like, you have to burn yourself out before you rise. And this is exactly that moment. This tremendous opportunity has presented itself through a global pandemic. It's a top opportunity for us to come together, work together to help each other in the rebuilding. And I know that, you know, we tend to, every panel I've been on, everybody says, what are the points where Black and Asian solidarity happened, right? And to be honest, twofold why that question offends me. One, why do you always like say, Black people, you know, what's going on, right? And then like that, it's like, why, like, that shocks me, right? That actually offends me, to say like, what's happening? You know, like, why are, you know, like, that false narrative is really dangerous. And I think I am very, very offended personally by that. But I also feel like we need to think about, as we think about rebuilding, we need to think about, instead of always reaching back into history, but to make new history, right? We need to create a moment where our kids can say, you know, during the days after the pandemic, right? That's when the real rebuilding began. And that's where real solidarity work began. That's what I'm looking for. And, you know, I keep telling people, you know, we are capable of walking and chewing gum at the same time. And we can love our community, but we can also love other communities. It's okay. Our job as human beings is to see the best in each other. We see the best of ourselves in other communities, other humans. And in New York City, my gosh, you know, we are all riding the subway together. We need to be together to be able to work together, but really to create community. I know this sounds very idealistic. This would have been my, young, hyper progressive 15-year-old. But I think those values and that belief still holds true for me. That I think there is opportunity, and I think this is the hill that we're going to have to die on.
Tiffany?
I would say conversations like this give me hope. I'll steal Joanne's answer and say I hope to meet all of you and connect with all of you in person, because I think this conversation would have been a lot more interesting over some cocktails and a camera. But yeah, you know, there are days and mornings where I get up and I am just bursting at the seams with a righteous anger. And then I have conversations like this and I am bursting at the seams with a collective love. And I think those two things really do sustain our communities, given all that we've survived in this country. And just being able to speak honestly and unfiltered among ourselves, and to share, you know, this conversation and have other people bear witness to it, I hope will cast a wide influence across all of our respective communities in America, because none of us can make it alone. And as I look at this screen, I see what America looks like, particularly by the year 2044. And I'm thrilled and honored and will keep doing the work to make sure that we are the architects of the new America and that we have a voice to shape democracy, because I think it can happen. So I'm definitely hopeful about the future. And I'm hopeful for you, Jose, to see you very soon, and hopeful to have you on my show soon as well, because we need your voice on my show. So I'll be reaching out to you to make sure that we get you on the Cross Connection.
Well, that sounds great to me. And I have to say, by the way, as I kind of wrap up this conversation, I'm thinking about when Joanne was saying this creating of new history. I immigrated here in 1993 from the Philippines, the same year that Toni Morrison won the Nobel Prize for Literature. And she had to give a speech. Apparently, when you win a Nobel, you have to give like a lecture. And I have now, I think, memorized the entire speech, which to me is the most powerful speech ever given about the power of language. And there's a line in the speech where she says, narrative is radical, creating us at the very moment it is being created. And so I think this is a radical conversation. And when I say radical, I mean that in the most positive, most progressive way we possibly can. So thank you for this. And thank you for this history that we're all creating together. Thank you for joining us.